Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first ever joint meeting of the Anchorage Advisory Committee and the Marine Environmental Resource Task Force. I would like to thank everybody who's here today. We'll do some introductions in a minute, but let's do the Pledge of Allegiance first.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Excellent. So welcome to everybody who is here, who are our members of the committees and who are our liaisons with either staff or the council. We'll get to all those introductions. Just want to say a few words first. I am Chris Riedel-King. I'm the chairperson of the Anchorage Advisory Committee, and my co-host for today is
Dave Nussbaum. I'm the chairperson for the Marine Environmental Resource Task Force Advisory Committee.
The purpose of today's meeting is really to bring these two committees together to hear information from our wonderful guest speaker that could be beneficial to us both. While we have different remits, we also have a bit of overlap in some of the things that we're concerned about when we think about what we're trying to advise the council on. So we thought it would make sense, rather than to have a guest speaker come for both of the committees, to do it at once and get all of our conversation on the table at one time. So I would like to do introductions for the Anchorage Advisory Committee first, and then we'll do MERTF. And if you could all just introduce yourself and say how long you've been on our committee and what you would like to learn about today. I'll start, as I said, Chris Riedel-King. I've been on this committee about a year and a half, and I'm just interested in understanding what this organization does and how it could be beneficial for us.
Ted Lawwell. I've been on the committee 12 or 13 years, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Ed Schoonover. I've been on the Anchorage Committee for, well, I think it's a year and a half. Since that's how long you're saying, I think it's about a year. And looking forward to the presentation.
Hi, Sam Lurie. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Anchorage Advisory Committee, and I've been on the committee about 10 years. I'm a Coast Guard 100-ton Master Captain and retired IRS enrolled agent.
Good job.
Yes, Jennifer Rusk. I'm on the Anchorage Committee as well as MERTF Committee, which is the Marine Environmental Resource Task Force. I'm an environmentalist. I care about our water greatly, our water quality. And I've been on MERTF. I believe this is my 4th term. This is my first term on Anchorage Committee. And thank you so much, Chris, for coming. I really appreciate it. I think we'll all benefit from your expertise. Thank you.
And our town council liaison?
Well, Chris, my name is Jim Anderhold. I'm the vice mayor for the town of Fort Myers Beach. And so John doesn't have to stand up. He doesn't have a mic. John King is my fellow colleague from the council, and he is the liaison to the MERTF committee.
Pleasure to meet both. Good morning, Captain. My name's Dave Nussbaum. I'm the chairperson of the MERTF committee. I have been on the committee now. This is going on my 2nd year. I'm a second generation owner on Fort Myers Beach, and I'm on the MERTF committee to actively promote the stewardship of the island. Our home is on the beach, and we are very concerned about the impact of the discharge going down the river and what it does to the shoreline and the economic impact. So I'm very interested in hearing, your comments on this. And with that, Leo's got you.
I'm Leo Sand. I'm on the MERTF committee. I've only been here 3 months or 4 months or so. I'm interested in learning more about the clean water. I live on the Gulf of America, right on Caper Beach. So thank you for all the information you gave us as well. So I appreciate it.
And I'm Sharon Hagstrom. I'm on the MERTF committee, same amount of time as Leo. And I too live on the Gulf of America. And I've been down here in Southwest Florida for about 45 years. So I'm very interested in hearing you today. Very.
And we have Robert Howell that's remote. I'm gonna
Yes,
get
I'm
him.
here.
Okay, you're on, Robert.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm just very interested in better educating ourselves and the public about all the options to better the island. That's why we're very thankful you're here.
Thank you. And Ed?
Yeah, Ed Rude. I've been living on the island for 15 years now, and on the beach. And I've been on the committee, on the MERF committee this past year, and also very interested in what you got to the information you're going to give us, and about the effects of the discharge from Okeechobee down the river.
And Chad?
Yes, sir. Environmental manager at Town of Fort Myers Beach.
Chad is our staff liaison, and is Kurt?
My name is Captain Curtis Ludwig. I've been the harbor master here for about 9 months now, and I'm very interested. What do you have to say about the red tide and algae bloom off the coast right now? But thank you for being here, Chris.
So Kurt, while you have the mic, would you just do a little introduction as to what the remit of the Anchorage Advisory Committee is and how, you know, you see us assisting you and your staff who are out there in the audience today as well?
Yes, absolutely. I believe the Anchorage Committee, committee members help me give me insight of what the residents in the town are saying, and giving me advice and how to kind of operate the mooring field and kind of to better the town here on Fort Myers Beach.
So it's about marine operations, navigable waterways, canals, that sort of thing.
Canals, clean water. We are right now in a project of cleaning all the canals and getting all the debris out from the past hurricanes that we've had here.
And Chad, could you give a brief,
Sure.
summation of the MERF committee for the captain?
Sure. And just to build on what Curtis said, the inception of the mooring field area was to clean up the waters, get boats on mooring and balls to stop both the anchor scarring in and around the bay, as well as to pump them out of sewage and remove that pollution, for lack of a better term, in the waterways. So that's been a very successful project that the town has had over the last maybe up to 10 years. It's got to be getting close to 10 years. Anyway, so that's a great thing about the mooring field and its contribution to improve water quality. As for the MERF committee, Marine and Environmental Resource Task Force, so we have a lot of natural resources here on Fort Myers Beach. Our economic center is the beach, socioeconomic importance for both residents and businesses alike. Tourism is one of the number one economic drivers of the U.S. and definitely the number one for Fort Myers Beach and Lee County. So it's important, and they weigh in on that a lot, as do they with all environmental wildlife listed species, vegetation, and just finding that balance between maintaining and conserving the resources and allowing people, our residents, visitors, and businesses alike to enjoy them and profit off them and be successful.
Okay, thank you, Chad. And with that, I believe we've introduced everyone from both committees and the staff. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, who is Captain Chris Whitman. Captain Whitman is a fourth-generation Florida native. He's a co-founder of Captains for Clean Water. And after witnessing the consequences of Florida's water mismanagement. He decided to get involved. His extensive experience as a fishing and hunting guide, nationally renowned tournament angler, on-camera host, and TV show producer allows him to engage leading brands and personalities across the industry and identify opportunities to expand the organization's reach. The organization works to advance science-based solutions through efforts focused on awareness and education, empowering people like you to speak up for our water quality and hold elected officials accountable. Together, we've united the outdoor industry, environmental groups, business community, and concerned citizens around these important issues, and are seeing more people than ever getting involved in the fight for clean water. I stole this off your website. As a result, progress is happening at a record pace, but we have a long way to go and we need your help. So that's a little background on our captain and his organization. And with that, Captain Whitman, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here and appreciate the opportunity. As David said, I'm Captain Chris Whitman, born and raised here. I grew up on Sanibel Island. My mother grew up on Fort Myers Beach. Our family's, deep roots here. My mom's best friend's family owned Fishtail Marina. Harry Nichols was like a second grandfather to me. And so I spent all of my childhood either on the beach here or the beach of Sanibel. And so very special place, dear to my heart. Captains for Clean Water, we were founded out of water crisis. 2016, I had come back from a season of filming my TV show, and all of my fellow fishing guides were out of work. We had massive discharges from Lake Okeechobee, which were nothing new to us. It was something I had seen my whole life, and throughout my whole life had seen a constant decline and degradation of the fishery that ultimately not only kind of built me into who I was, but also what I built my business on. And many of the oyster bars and seagrass beds that I fished at the mouth of the river as a child, by the time I was a fishing guide, no longer existed. So these discharges weren't foreign, but what was happening was I started to see them in a different light. It was less of an inconvenience as an angler and became more of an impact economically to my business, to my fellow fishing guides, to my industry. And that was really kind of the catalyst that myself and the other founder, Daniel Andrews, who's also a fishing guide, took a look back and at if this is the path that we continue on, the future of businesses like ours that depend on water quality, depend on clean environment, healthy ecosystems, basically the center of our tourism industry here, all the future of those businesses were at stake. We knew that because our clients were going home. $1,000 to $1,500 a day as a fishing guide, you make your money during those times. So you get a couple weeks of those people that leave, it hits you pretty hard. What we realized at that point was we started looking into something has to change, and why hasn't this changed in our whole lifetime? And through that process, we learned that this wasn't a problem that we needed science to figure out, like, how do we fix it? It wasn't one of these things where it's like, this thing's happening, we don't know how to. This problem had been identified in the 80s. A solution wasn't a problem where it's like, okay, we know what the problem is, now how do we fix it? A solution was put in place the year I started guiding, in the year 2000. And so these discharges were a result of man's changing of the hydrology of Florida. Back at the turn of the century, we looked at Florida as worthless swamp, and how are we going to tame the swamp and and make it into something productive, and in the process, an effort, both private and ultimately the government got involved to drain the Everglades. And that effort ultimately was successful. The flow of water that once flowed from Orlando through the Kissimmee River Basin to Lake Okeechobee, and then overflowed the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee, and ultimately slowly meandered all the way down to the Florida Keys and Florida Bay. That one giant river, giant system, was compartmentalized, was fractured. The water was stopped at Lake Okeechobee. The area south of Lake Okeechobee was drained through a series of canals out to the Atlantic Ocean. It was compartmentalized with levees and dikes and canal systems. Tamiami Trail from Fort Myers to Miami acted as another levee, cutting off flow from the north to the south. And the water that then used to flow to Everglades National Park and Florida Bay was then held back into Lake Okeechobee. As a result, that water had to go somewhere, and Fort Myers and St. Lucie became the emergency relief valve for that water. What scientists saw and ecologists saw and everyday people and fishermen saw was that action, 100 years ago, started a chain reaction of the imbalance of one major ecosystem. Our ecosystem here, we see it as our backyard, but it's all part of the same ecosystem as the Everglades and the Keys, and it's one giant Lake Okeechobee. And so they realized that in doing so, we're getting destroyed by the volume of fresh water that comes. The other component to that is it's polluted after decades of pollution. But even if that water was drinkable water, perfectly clean, that's what would kill our oyster beds and our seagrass. The nutrients aren't what was killing the basis of the ecosystem. It was the fact that you're taking a saltwater fishery and you're dumping billions of gallons of fresh water into it for months at a time. You essentially take a saltwater area and turn it into fresh water. If you had a saltwater aquarium and you took all the salt out of it, even if the water's clean, everything dies. And so that was the longer lasting was the salinity plummet from these discharges. It's what killed the basis. And then that's what binds sediment. There's this huge butterfly effect. At the other end of it, Florida Bay and the Everglades were suffering because they weren't getting the water that they historically and naturally got. And so Florida Bay was becoming hypersaline, 3 times saltier than the Gulf of Mexico. The result there was very much like us becoming too fresh. The hypersalinity water killed the seagrass, killed the oysters. As the seagrass died, it decomposed, it spurred algae blooms as the nutrients were released that were sequestered within those grasses. And it started a domino effect. The Everglades began to dry out. It started to change the hydrology. It started to change the plants and the tree islands. It started to change the different trees and the ecosystem as a whole. The Biscayne Aquifer, which is the drinking water supply for over 10 million Floridians, began to go dry, and they started to get salt water intruding through the ground where Miami-Dade people were turning on their taps and they were getting salt water coming out of their taps because the water was no longer flowing over top of that area and percolating down and recharging the aquifer. And so scientists realized all this, and a bunch of extremely bright people, much smarter than myself, got together and they came up with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. It's known as CERP. It is the largest ecosystem restoration project ever undertaken in the world, and it's here in South Florida. It is essentially 68 projects that reconnect the system that man went in and disconnected a century ago. And so it does so without displacing our current, communities, developments, farms, agriculture. It works within the current confines of society to reconnect and mimic the timing and delivery of water back to the way Mother Nature had it. Essentially, it reconnects Lake Okeechobee back to the Everglades and Florida Bay. And it does so through removing some of those barriers to flow. If you've driven from here to Miami in the last couple of years, you'll see now that there's big sections of bridges as you get over towards the Miccosukee reservations. Those bridges are allowing the water to flow out of Water Conservation Area 3A into Shark River Slough, which was the historic flowway into the Everglades. Going up through there, they're taking down some of the levees and backfilling in some of the canals that was shunting that water off to the Atlantic Ocean and keeping the center of the glades artificially dry. And then the heart of Everglades restoration lies at the south end of what's called the EAA, which is the Everglades Agricultural Area, south of Lake Okeechobee, and that's where the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir is being built. And this is a massive reservoir that will take Lake Okeechobee's waters during the wet season, during the rainy season, and instead of discharging those waters to our coast, they'll take those waters into that reservoir, fill up that reservoir, and then it will be metered out through an engineered wetland, which a filter marsh known as an STA, to the Everglades throughout the dry season, mimicking how Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades and the River of Grass once functioned, where the water would overflow, slowly take months to meander through that River of Grass and ultimately reach Florida Bay. So the water that fell in the wet season in the north part of the system is what hydrated the southern part of the system throughout the dry season. So Everglades restoration is designed to do that. Fast forward that to 2016, Everglades restoration was a bipartisan effort at the time between our governor, Jeb Bush, and our president, Bill Clinton. It is a partnership between the state of Florida and the federal government. It's a 50-50 cost share. And in the year 2000, they signed that into law in the Oval Office, and everybody popped champagne bottles and thought, great, we're going to fix this problem. It's going to take 30 years to do so, and several $billion. So in 2016, when I speak of this water crisis that I came back to, we're just over the halfway point of Everglades restoration's timeline, and not a single one of those 68 projects had been completed. What we learned was that there was one real critical missing link and void. It wasn't the scientists. It wasn't engineering. We had the largest engineering firm in the world, the Army Corps of Engineers, tasked with building these projects. It wasn't environmentalists. Environmentalists have been screaming forever, this is killing the sea turtles and the manatees and the dolphins and the fish and you name it. It was really the collective voice of stakeholders that were impacted. And as a result of their absence, the absence of those voices, special interests, the industrial sugar industry, had been successful in just essentially lobbying decision makers to kind of kick the can down the road. They saw the current system, and they still see the current system, the status quo of water management. It works perfectly for them. You're keeping the Everglades area artificially dry in the wet season, and then artificially wet in the dry season, the Everglades agricultural area. Well, that's 500,000 acres of land right in the middle of that ecosystem, right below Lake Okeechobee and right above what is remaining of the River of Grass. And so when you do that, if you're trying to manage that much land, the total opposite of how the ecosystem works, you actually want Lake Okeechobee high throughout the dry season, because it's then you want it managed as a reservoir, not a natural part of the ecosystem. If you hold Lake Okeechobee high in the dry season, that means when you enter the following wet season, there is no capacity within the lake to hold more water, because you've held it back artificially for a backup water supply. And so the result is we get those discharges. So they had been very successful through lobbying, the typical way that politics are influenced, in kind of slowing progress. You had the largest restoration projects, cost billions of dollars. It just wasn't being adequately funded. And as a result, very little was happening. What we recognized in our philosophy was if more people knew about this issue and more people knew about the solution that was available and was in place for the issue, that more people would then be vocal, would use their voice, and that voice would create public pressure. And the public pressure had been the missing link, and that public pressure would drive the political will needed to fund these projects. And that's why we built Captains for Clean Water, was to educate people first and foremost on this. Because during that time when we were out of work, you could go and ask a bartender, a realtor, somebody in the hotel industry, a fellow fishing guide, somebody just a tourist on the beach. You could go and ask them. Every single one of them knew there was a problem. Every single one. But if you ask 10 people, you might get 10 different answers about why it was happening or whose fault it was or what the problem was or if there was a solution or not a solution. And so we realized that if first and foremost, if we needed to work backwards, we needed political will. In order to get political will, we needed public pressure. If we expected public pressure to happen, people had to use their voice. In order to get people to use their voice, they had to be educated and confident in what they were saying in order to be empowered to use their voice. And so we built the organization to do just that, to educate stakeholders, empower them to advocate on their behalf, the behalf of their businesses, and then give them a mechanism to both track opportunities like asking the government to fund Everglades restoration and track threats like bad water policy that may backtrack those restoration projects. And so that's why we built the organization. And since then, that was 2016 in February. Since then, that philosophy and that model has been extremely successful. We have engaged millions of people across the country. It's important to engage people outside just Florida because it's a federal partnership. So this funding for the federal side has to come through the Water Resources Development Act. And so you need the other 49 states to say, yeah, let's send billions of dollars to Florida to restore the Everglades. And so that education outside Florida is very important. But one of the key components for us here and the relevancy to Fort Myers Beach is the impact on the business community. You said it, the tourism industry. We commissioned a study, which I believe you all have maybe a one-sheeter on, and I don't have is the other side of this? Yeah, okay. So on the back side of this one-sheeter, this study is just Lee, Collier, and Charlotte County. And the thought here is, I got involved in this because I care about tarpon and oyster bars and snook and that. But policymakers need to see, a language that they can convert to, why are we investing money in this? And that's jobs, it's tax dollars, it's the typical thing. So this study took all of the information from just those 3 counties. It didn't include the East Coast, the Keys, anywhere else. And during this, during the water crisis of 2018 and 19, how many of those people here in this room were here for that water crisis? Right. It shut us down. During that water crisis, Jacksonville reported a 13 to 15% decline, economic loss, because of our water crisis. Much like the BP oil spill. We didn't have any oil on our beaches, but we saw an economic decline because of it. So this is not including any of those. This is just looking at Lee, Collier, and Charlotte County. Lost property values, $17.8 billion. That's a big one. Lost economic output, $5.2 billion. Property taxes, $60.3 million. And this is over a couple of months. This isn't years. Outdoor recreation, $8.1 billion. The jobs one, 43,000 jobs. We all remember 2019, we had to have the food banks out here on the islands providing groceries to people who worked in the hospitality industry because they literally could not feed their family. The hotels were empty, the restaurants were empty. So this water quality is the #1 issue that faces our community that we can control. We're sitting here in recovery from a hurricane that hit us years ago, and we can insure against hurricanes. The process to rebuild and remain and stay in business is a very, very difficult one. But if we're to suffer a water crisis on the heels of those natural disasters or a pandemic or anything else like that, that is the nail in the coffin for our businesses. It's the nail in the coffin for our communities. It quite literally will reshape our communities when those businesses and those people have no other option but to move away. And the tourists that save up all year to bring their family here to enjoy our resources, if they come here and they have that one bad experience, I don't know if anybody's owned a business here, but you can have Yelp and Google reviews. You can have all these great reviews, and you get 2 or 3 people on there saying, this is a terrible place to stay. Don't ever go. The food here is terrible. That does real damage. And so in the day and age of social media and Yelp, when people save up, they come here, spend tens of thousands of dollars to bring their families here, and there's dead fish on the beach. Their kids can't go swimming. They can't go fishing. They don't come back, and that word travels. And Jacksonville's decline is an example of that. And so I would say that the big thing that the town of Fort Myers Beach can do is to recognize that water quality is the most important thing. If you have a legislative priority, that should be number one into perpetuity. That is the one thing that will be the driver of your businesses, the culture here, the way of life of the people who come here, everything. And so I would also say that the municipalities and the business communities and the people that make up those communities are one of the most important voices in driving progress. Those are voices that you can have a paid lobbyist walking around the halls of Tallahassee or Washington, D.C., and they can have some impact. But if you have real businesses, people who have worked their entire lives to retire here because of what we have, or people who are building their lives on the back of a business that is foundation is here, those voices are authentic voices that carry a tremendous amount of weight in the halls of Tallahassee and Washington, D.C. And those voices are the ones that we've seen affect change. And so here we are 10 years later than after we started Captains for Clean Water, and many of those voices have been heard. The city of Sanibel, the chamber on Sanibel, the chamber on Fort Myers Beach, Jackie, they've all been extremely engaged in this process with us. They've been to DC with us. They've been to Tallahassee with us. They've made it known to policymakers that funding these projects and better water management, better management of Lake Okeechobee is the number one critical ask. And as a result of that, 10 years later, over 55 of those 68 projects are now under construction, are being built. The bridges that I spoke of on Tamiami Trail are one of those. That reservoir that will reduce our discharges with these other projects up to 80%. It doesn't eliminate the problem, but I sure as heck would rather be hit with a switch off the tree than a baseball bat. And that's what that will do. And so progress is being made, but the reality is the efforts to maintain the status quo continuously exist. Those efforts actually become stronger and more resource put into them, the more action and the more people that get involved to drive change. But real change is happening, and the power of a unified voice from all of South Florida advocating to policymakers in Washington, D.C. and in Tallahassee to say, fund these projects, get these projects done as quickly as possible, because they are a cost to the taxpayer. But we know that for every $1 spent on Everglades restoration, $4 is returned back into the economy. So it is. I would make that investment on any, with all of my money, a 4-to-1 return every single day of the week. And so, if we expect to see this completed, and we're not talking years, we're talking several years, but we are at the hump of it. We're about to be over the hump. The light is at the end of the tunnel. We have to continue to fund this. The faster we fund it, the less it costs us. There's every day everything goes, the more expensive it gets. A bag of groceries today, much more expensive than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So the faster we complete these projects, it's never going to be more economical than it is today. Certainly not than it was yesterday. So I would just encourage the town and the members and the citizens to first get up to speed as much as possible on this. We have an extremely talented team at Captains for Clean Water. We put together a lot of resources in multitude of mediums, however you would prefer to digest that information, from written blogs, reports, video content, any of those things. I'd be happy to share a resource document that has a ton of those available in one big list with links. But I would say get up to speed on what we do, what Everglades restoration is, the role everyone plays, and then lend every bit of effort you can into that. It's what is needed to preserve the future of why we all live here. So be happy to take any questions.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate your perspective that business and environmental concerns must work together and can work together. What are your biggest obstacles? I mean, what are the big obstacles right now that you see to keeping the momentum going besides the unification of our voices?
Biggest obstacles would somewhat vary year to year, but ultimately they are losing momentum in this. The loss of momentum could come from people getting complacent. If we have a few years of decent water quality, kind of goes back of mind. Could come from us getting completely annihilated by a hurricane. Could come from a pandemic. When there's a national, international, worldwide pandemic going on, kind of puts discharges from Lake Okeechobee a little bit back of mind. When your house has 16 feet of water in it, it kind of puts the water in the bay. It puts it from back of mind to directly in your living room is what it does. But so those are, I guess, the lack of momentum, and we're good at navigating how do we keep attention on this without. You can't force it when we're all trying to literally survive. It is what it is, but that's probably the number one risk. The part of that, there's a significant amount and effort of kind of misinformation and confusion campaigns that do come out of the sugar industry, simply to keep people on the sideline. Unified businesses and voices that have come together and been vocal. Those people like myself, I'm a fishing guide that literally grew up on an island, and I was not involved whatsoever. If those people and those voices stay on the sideline, then all you got to do is walk around and hand out campaign checks, and you get what you want. If people are engaged, so the reality of the politics of it, where there is a real effort to confuse people or divide people, get the East Coast fighting the West Coast. The West Coast, you guys are getting all the discharges because the rich people live over on the East Coast. And then they tell the East Coast, you're getting the discharges because all the rich people over there in Sanibel Island don't want the water. Or the inland fishermen, bass fishermen, they don't care about the lake. They just care about the tarpon and the saltwater fish. Or, hey, the tourism industry, this is agriculture against tourism. This isn't about agriculture versus tourism. It's not agriculture as a whole. It's two big companies that are driving water policy that have no benefit to cattle ranching, citrus, vegetable. It's not so. But those intentional divides it does happen, And the whole reason is to keep people divided. You look at it in politics today in the world. If you get people divided, they're not focused on what the real problem is. And so those would be the risks. And the way you overcome all of those risks, sustaining that energy in the movement or combating those is through education. If people understand it, they recognize it, they see through the division, and they stay engaged throughout times when our water is good or we have other problems on our plate.
Thank you, Captain Whitman. Question I have is, when Governor DeSantis first came in, he went through and cleaned house on, and I don't know the exact name, but the people that were on the water board for Florida. Some of them were fought their removal from their position, but he replaced it. Do you feel those people are adequately driving the Everglades program? And if not, should we be petitioning to replace them?
Great question. It's the South Florida Water Management District. And you are right. When I started this, we would go there, and it was kind of like, go ahead, you've got your 3 minutes, but while you're talking, I'm going to pick up my phone and make sure you know that I'm not listening to you. One of those board members, when we were talking about that very reservoir, there was comments made, somewhere that basically saying, we're going to release the land that they were going to build the reservoir on. And people in the back of the room started grumbling. Those are taxpayers. That agency is funded through ad valorem tax. And so their constituencies started kind of grumbling. And one of the board members from the dais referred to them as the peanut gallery and asked them, appreciate if she was subsequently removed. But to answer your question, are they adequate? Absolutely. That agency has done a 180. They are leading Everglades restoration at lightning speed. The result of those projects being under construction now, and many of them completed, are a result of that new governing board and that new drive there. The chairman of that governing board is Chauncey Goss from Sanibel. His father is Porter Goss, was the architect of the Sanibel plan, was a member of Congress when the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was put into law. And that governing board that is there today is doing an incredible job, and we're fortunate to have them there.
Okay. Are they lacking funding then to speed the process up, or is it just time because it's a monumental task?
Yeah, it's time because it's a monumental task. We have seen record funding out of both the state and the federal government every single year for the past 6 years. We've seen it from both parties. We saw it during Trump's first term. We saw it during Biden's term. We expect to see it again out of D.C. We've seen it every year out of Tallahassee under Governor DeSantis' direction. Before we started, you'd be talking $50-60 million a year in budget into this stuff. I think the last governor's budget was $1.2 billion. Significant resources are being put in, and they're being put in based on what the Army Corps says they're ready to execute on and what the Water Management District says they're ready to execute on. It's just not arbitrary numbers. It's, hey, we're ready to do XYZ. This is what this part for over the next year or 2 years is going to cost us. Here's money. So it's not that there is now, that being said, there is constant threat to that funding. Diverting it other places, whether or not the legislature fulfills that side of it with the governor's budget or the president's budget. Where we keep that funding and ensure that funding continues is with that constant public pressure.
Thank you.
What questions do the committee members have?
Chris, out of the 55 projects that are underway, how many are completed?
I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I could absolutely get it. I know. I can name a few of them that are really the big. Some of them are very, very significant big. But so the bridges across Tamiami Trail, is one, that's allowing that water to move where it would bottleneck up in the bottom part of the system and result in flooding of like the Tree Islands and the Miccosukee reservation there. So that water can now move under there into Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough. Another is as they start to push that water east to go under those bridges, there's 8.5 miles of community off Miami called Las Palmas that was built outside of the Everglades protection levee. So when they developed these areas, they built a levee all the way along the side of the Everglades. And there's this section of community they built on the wet side of the levee because the Everglades were being held artificially dry. But now if you go rehydrate that area and push that water back in, you would flood this 8.5 square miles. And so they looked at, do you go in and it's not thousands of properties, but it's 8.5 square miles, a fair amount of people. Do you go in and take it through eminent domain? What is the timeline for a legal process of something like that? What they came up with was the fastest way, and the Water Management District came up with this, would be to build a curtain wall around that 8.5 square miles, where they basically took a massive trencher, like you would put in a sprinkler system, went 60 feet down into the ground around that whole area, poured a curtain wall underground, and created this levee around it. So now they can raise the water table, because it wasn't just the surface water, it would push through the ground up into that area. So now they've separated that groundwater, so they're able to push that water back in without flooding out. That project's done as well. Some of them are massive pump stations. The S333 pump station moves water from that bottom part of the system back east so it can go under those bridges. They're currently raising Tamiami Trail so that roadbed doesn't get inundated with water. The filter marsh component of the STA for the EAA reservoir, so that's an engineered wetland. That's a 6,500 acre filter marsh. That is completed and is being grown in with aquatic vegetation as we speak. So those are some of the bigger ones that are completed. There's a number of others that are smaller, but I don't know the exact number of them. But I do know from looking at it's the integrated delivery schedule, the IDS, basically the workflow for SERP. If you look at that, I mean, the amount, it's like lightning speed over the last couple of years.
So you're 5 years from 2030, which is a 30-year plan back in 2000. Obviously, we're not going to make that. Right?
No.
What do you estimate it's going to be?
If funding stays consistent, yeah. If the funding stays there and doesn't get held up by lawsuits and whatnot, I would estimate late 30s. I think the EAA reservoir slated to be completed, I want to say 2035. That's one that if it's not delayed, the sugar industry is suing the Army Corps of Engineers right now over the operations of that reservoir, basically saying that you could build the reservoir, but they should get the water that's in it instead of the Everglades, or at least have priority to the water. And if you do that, what it does is it does the same thing as what happens with Lake Okeechobee. You want that water when? Through dry season, in case you need it. Well, if you're still getting water from the lake, you don't need, so you basically just hold the reservoir full through dry season, and then you enter wet season, say, okay, we don't need it, go ahead and send it to the Everglades. Okay, well, now the Everglades is getting rain, now the reservoir's full, so you can't take water out of Lake Okeechobee. So it just basically renders that reservoir from a dynamic reservoir that adds capacity to just a water supply reservoir that's always full.
So I seem to remember reading articles about funding that you must have gotten some big boost in fundings from 2016 to present day.
Massive.
Yeah. Are you feel that's enough to complete this project?
No, it has to come every year.
Okay. And how much every year?
It changes the IDS schedule, and you can pull it up on Army Corps' website, and it changes with inflation, but it's kind of like building a house. When you start it, the amount of money you need to do the site work and the foundation, it kind of escalates as you get to the middle part of that. And when you get on the back end of the project, it goes back down. We are at that peak right now. Over the next probably 5 years, that we're probably at the height of what the funding requirements would be, and then we start to go on a downtrend.
So when this is completed at the end of, let's say at the end of the 2039 or whatever it is, do you think we'll see less water coming to us and less pollutants coming towards us?
Absolutely. I think we would see probably, depending on the year, between a 60 and 80% reduction in those discharges.
Thank you.
How soon can we expect the level to start going down on the discharges?
So we've already seen that a little bit, and it's not a like we wait to see the benefits until SERP is completed. There's incremental improvements as projects come online, like the bridges, like the curtain wall. The dike around Lake Okeechobee, the Herbert Hoover Dike, at one point was beginning to fail. There was seepage around that, so when the lake would get high, it would seep. It would threaten flooding those communities around the lake. The Army Corps went in, did a rehabilitation of that entire dike. So at that point, they had been managing Lake Okeechobee off of what's called LORS 08, so Lake Okeechobee system, LOSUM, or LORS 08, Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, and they were taking into account that old dike. And so when the lake would just start to get high, they would be dumping water to the coast. After rehabilitating the dike, they looked at and built a new management plan, which is like the Army Corps' war book, says when to pull what lever. That's LORS or LOSUM, and that process was like a 4 or 5 year process, including stakeholder input, including municipalities, and they came up with a new regulation schedule. And so through that schedule alone, we're looking at on average about a 30% reduction in the damaging discharges. So you can't manage your way out of the system without the infrastructure, out of that problem without the infrastructure. But they're looking at, instead of flying that airplane on autopilot and it just saying, "Oh, it's to this point, dump it," they're flying it manually. So there's a lot more control, but it's a lot more variable. And as a result of that, we've seen improvements already. If you look at the lake levels after Hurricane Ian and then after Hurricane Milton, we would have, under LORS, we would have been getting massive discharges since about July of last year. We had not started receiving any large discharges until just at the beginning of dry season, which is actually when we can take more because we don't have local basin runoff, and it's not you don't have that compounding effect. And even so, the longer that waited, half the water that leaves Lake Okeechobee does through evaporation. So just changing the timing of when they're sending water to us, we're getting, I haven't checked it in the last couple of days, but we're getting about 23 to 2,500 cubic feet per second out of the Franklin locks. Last time I checked a few days ago. This time of year, you want to see about 1,500 to 2,000 cubic feet per second would be like the ideal range. So not great, but not, the 10, 11,000 cubic feet per second that we've seen during those water crises.
If one wanted to learn more, is there a website we can look at?
Captainsforcleanwater.org.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
We would appreciate that resource list. If you would send that to
Sure.
us, then we could circulate it amongst people.
Sure, yeah, and it's a lot. There's videos, there's third-party videos, there's news articles. It's just kind of a media compilation of things that you can kind of sift through.
I have a question for the captain.
Yes.
Is there also septic systems, private and municipal, that are affecting the water quality?
Of course, septic systems affect water quality. Inadequate sewage infrastructure affects water quality. People fertilizing their yards affect. Every one of us have an input for sure. Phosphate mining. You name it. Washing your car has some effect. That being said, there's not less people using the restroom today than there was yesterday. There's 1,000 people a day moving to Florida. We don't see these crippling events that shut down our economy until we have these discharges. So it's not to say that I always say Florida's dying from 1,000 paper cuts. But if you look at it as a patient on an operating table who had a heart attack, in the process of the heart attack, they wrecked their car and broke their arm, that patient's on the operating table. If we focus on the broken arm, the patient's going to die. And so, not to say that we should not fix inadequate sewage infrastructure for our growing communities or convert septic tanks that are within flood zones that may have an input. But we've got to address the heart of what'll shut us down, and that's those Lake Okeechobee discharges.
So you would look at the septic problem more towards the end?
I would just say we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Sure.
But we could fix every single septic problem we have today, and if these Lake Okeechobee discharges keep coming, it doesn't matter.
Sam?
For 2 questions. First question is the big $1 billion referendum. Was that 2000?
So so 2000. So this is an interesting one. When they were looking to put Everglades restoration into action, they were looking at acquiring land to build these projects, and there was a ballot initiative that basically asked taxpayers, would you support a stamp tax on real estate to fund these projects? It was, I believe it was Amendment 1. The populace voted over 70% to support being taxed to fix that. So to show, the level of willingness of investment from the stakeholders is there. So that first part of that funding in the first part of Everglades restoration was not being used to its highest and best use. And what you saw was projects that were ancillary, that were not politically challenging. They would put money at those projects or would spread money around on projects to where you didn't really have the juice to complete any of them. It's like, I've got enough money to build one house and I'm going to start building 15.
So that referendum, which was the big money back then, that's accounted for, but maybe not spent in the best way.
Yeah, well, yes, and it's a reoccurring funding, and so that's a portion of where Everglades stuff comes from. The state legislature has to provide funding back to the Water Management District for Everglades restoration projects, and that's the state funding you're talking about. But also Washington, D.C. has to put in their half, and that comes through Water Resource Development Act. So that's also competing with a dam or something else in another state. And in WARDA, in that WARDA package, Everglades restoration's the lion's share of what's taking that money. So it's really important also. One of the other reasons why we've got to get it done as fast as possible, because how long are the other 49 states going to say, yeah, let's keep sending billions of dollars to Florida?
So you're lobbying the best you can to get the most use out of those dollars.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Second question was, this morning on the news, they showed a machine the size of a boombox that is the cure for red tide. Do you have any information on that?
Oh, have I ever heard about cures for red tide?
It's on the news all day today.
Must be
so
it then
out.
if it's on the news.
It's about this big.
Yeah. No, so look, I'm not going to knock any solution to red tide or harmful algae blooms. I'm not a scientist. What I believe though is, and the philosophy that we have is, we need to be addressing the cause of the problems, not the symptoms. If I keep getting headaches because I have a heart issue and my blood pressure is dropping, the answer is not to keep taking Tylenol. So Should we implement innovative technologies in the process to try to mitigate what the impact is of a harmful algae bloom? Sure, absolutely. Should I allow that to be an easy scapegoat for policymakers to say, look, we're doing something, when it's really addressing the symptom of a problem rather than the cause? Definitely not.
What other questions?
Oh, well, actually, you all have already asked the questions, but I guess one for you, Chris, would be that we're just a little island, barrier island of 7 miles, and we're two committees that advise our town council. What can we do to move forward as a committee and a full-time, myself as a full-time resident, to better help you, your cause?
First, change that outlook. You're not just. I'm just one fishing guide. And that's the outlook I had for 16 years. You all are a critical voice, and no, there is no way that there is no too small. You'll be one individual community, a small island. Your voices are like critical component to driving the change. So what you can do is be educated on it, educate others on it. Make sure that any time there is a policymaker, a decision maker, an agency person, you see it every time people start to run for office, right? They hold town halls. They come here, I'm running for Congress, I'm running for Senate, I'm running for whatever, dog catcher. Ask them, what we care about is water quality. What are you going to do to improve our water quality? What are you going to do to advance Everglades restoration? That's the kind of pressure that will hold feet to the fire. I expect that kind of pressure from our donors and our board to make sure, what are you doing to get the most out of the resources that are coming into Captains for Clean Water to affect change? Pressure is good. And so I would say that, don't underestimate the size of this island or the group or the people or the businesses on it. Collectively, those voices are the most powerful thing that has affected change. And, you could walk outside right now and scream at the top of your lungs, and maybe some people within earshot would hear it. But if that same person's filled in a football stadium with 20,000 others that are screaming as well, the sound will be deafening. And so, I certainly would not underestimate your voice, and I would utilize your voice through first educating yourselves with the resources available. Captains for Clean Water, there's SCCF has great resources, Everglades Foundation has great resources, the South Florida Water Management District, and once you're educated, use your voice, and we try to provide multiple outlets for people to do so.
Thank you.
Kurt or Chad, any thoughts, questions?
I have a question. Cap, I saw a couple days ago you posted a video from a helicopter on the red tide that's off our coast right now. Appears that it's kind of hasn't been moving too much, kind of been, holding off here. Can you kind of update us with that, or what knowledge you have of that?
Yeah, so I haven't been up in the air since that, and that was probably, 10 days ago maybe. It seemed like that bloom seemed like it had kind of slowly been migrating south, and then we had some onshore winds. It was starting to come in. We were starting to get reports from fishing guides of red tide coming into the bay, some isolated fish kills, bait starting to die, things like that. So it is hard to say. However, conditions like we have today, we've got a pretty stiff offshore wind. That's definitely helpful to push that out and help break that up. And, red tide generally, if it's able to make its way into inshore, there's more fuel available for it, more nutrients in the water. We've also had very dry conditions, which is helpful. So it's kind of, I don't know. I don't want to. I don't know what. I haven't gone up and physically looked at it in a week or so. I have not been getting a ton of reports from our guide network that it's like getting crazy or worse. So I don't know exactly, but I'm hopeful that like conditions like we're having now will help to get that out. And if it can get out and eat itself out of fuel, it can kind of dissipate and go away.
Counselors, do you have any questions or thoughts?
Just have a quick question, Chris, and I don't mean to get political, but you talk about resources, and your tax status may not allow you to have this, but maybe you could recommend a voter guide to see who's taking money from Big Sugar, who's supporting Everglades restoration. How can voters get informed before they go to the ballot box?
Great question. So yeah, we are a 501c3. We are non-political. We don't endorse candidates. We do not give money to candidates. We don't even have a lobbyist. The people are our lobbyists. And so however, the most important thing there is, right, in order to be able to hold people accountable, you've got to have some idea. There are voter guides out there. If you Google them, you can find them. How incredible, you might see some that like give bad scores to some people. You've got to really look at it for water specifically, because there are people from both sides of the aisle that are not great, and there's people from both sides of the aisle that have done some great things. And just because they've done some great things before doesn't mean they always will, or vice versa. And so I think the number one thing there is when you have an opportunity to interact with people running for office or in office, would be to ask them how they've voted, what their position is. You could straight up ask them, do you take money from the sugar industry, and how much? It's not easy. It's a little bit cumbersome, and it's intended to be that way. But that's a great question. But you're right. We do not offer that. Our focus is educating those people, and we believe that educated people will seek out that type of information. Thanks.
Chad, do you have any questions for the captain?
Yeah, I have lots. Every time he says something, another question pops up. So we have we have a quantity issue and we have a quality issue.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing is that the quantity issue is going to get better with these reservoirs, kind of taking that water and not just blowing it out. Army Corps has these weekly updates where they take information from the stakeholders, and I would always get frustrated whenever it seems like we're blowing out the water during dry season, because there's a natural ebb and flow of our ecosystem, and there's value when it's wet and there's value when it's dry, and whenever we're changing that, it seems like it's an artificial, you're blowing out this big freshwater plume, which is a quantity issue, never mind the quality issue, and changing that ecosystem in a dry time when it should be dry. It should be more saline.
Okay. Yep.
And I guess with the new LOSUM, are y'all seeing any improvements to fisheries and our nurseries and catch effort kind of measurements?
Yes, and those also, there's a little bit of a lag. It's like a train starting and stopping.
Sure.
There. But yes, we are, and so it's a great point for clarity around sending water out during the dry season. So one of the impacts or results of us developing area is water sits on our land for a much shorter amount of time in our local basin. And so we actually, the upper estuary, so mouth of the Caloosahatchee River up to the Franklin Locks, actually needs that water during the dry season to maintain lower salinities in the upper estuary. So like even as recent as when I was a kid, there was tape grass, freshwater tape grass from like Thomas Edison's home all the way up to the Franklin Locks to the trestles. There's none of that now. That's a result of being too salty. So what would happen is we would get huge flushes of fresh water that would come out, would kill the seagrass out to Sanibel Island. Then they would shut that water off from Lake Okeechobee during the dry season to hold it back like a reservoir for for irrigation for sugar, and as a result, salt water would push all the way up to the Franklin locks, and so that salt water would kill the freshwater stuff that was up. And so you eliminated this mixing zone, that estuarian area where you had marine and fresh and a hard line on one side of the locks and a hard line out here and a desert in between. And so the need for some fresh water, and that's where I get that number of about 1,500 CFS to 2,000 CFS, that's the ideal amount of water coming out of Franklin locks into the estuary during the dry season. And that would mimic what would normally be coming off our watershed slowly from the wet season before we sped up our local watershed. And so SCCF has a lot more scientific information on that, but what their scientists are showing is we kind of need, the sweet spot's really like that 1,500, 1,700 CFS range. Anything above 2,000 is considered harmful. So where we need that to where that area kind of between the locks and the Cape Coral Bridge is the constant mixing zone of salt water. So you don't have salt water pushing all the way up to the lock structure. The challenge there is also when you get, when you're getting those discharges during the wet season, typically that local basin runoff would ramp up, but it's very flashy. So our local basin reacts very quick. So you might get a big push of water out of the river, it spikes, and then it tapers off for, a week or a few days, 2 weeks, whatever. What we see with the discharges from Lake Okeechobee is they ramp them up and then they hold them there for months on end. And so that's what the estuarian ecosystem can't sustain. Like oysters and seagrass, they can sustain pure fresh water for a few weeks. Outside of 30 days, the seagrass sheds its blades, starts to die, the oysters die. And so the flashiness of the local basin in the wet season, yes, there's a big push of water, but it's real up and down. It's when we start to span that and fill in those valleys during the wet season with those discharges that you see that real impact. And so the need for fresh water is kind of an artificial supplement to us changing our local watershed.
And then, are we seeing improvements with not having those blowouts of fresh water during the dry season?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's already, so when I grew up, we would fish, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, with the island, but basically from like Punta Rassa to the cattle docks, so to like the mouth of the river, to Sword Point, which would be like the point going into Mount Lachey, that zone right there in the mouth of the river. And it was like the best fishing. Turtle grass that was 2 feet long in the summertime. You could catch permit inshore there, giant snook, giant redfish. It's incredible. After 2016 and especially after 2018, that whole zone, there was zero grass, zero live oysters, completely gone. Since then, since the 2019 water crisis, we are starting to see signs of grass recovery around Fisherman's Key, Picnic Island. Some of those areas, there's actually where some of that stuff is starting to come back and recover. The thing about it is it may take 3 months to kill that stuff. And it could take a decade for it to come back. And so if in the time of that decade it starts to recover, but then every 3 years or so it gets knocked down again, you're just in this stair step of decline. To where you got to put it to where the swings of recovery are much more longer and spread out than the swings of impact.
Does stormwater drainage issues on different islands have anything to do with the killing of seagrass?
The stormwater drainage off the islands absolutely has a very significant impact. I would say it probably has more to do with algae blooms than it does the killing of the seagrass directly, because most of the impact of the seagrass is just that salinity, low salinity drop. However, it can be killed by lack of sunlight. So the water's becoming too turbid. That can happen because of microalgae blooms. You can get microalgae and macroalgae. A lot of times you'll see it where it washes up on the beach. We call it like red rolling moss is what the fishing guides call it. It looks like red tumbleweeds.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an algae bloom. It's a sign of excess nutrients in the water. And so what happens there is that the runoff doesn't kill the seagrass, but it fuels an algae bloom like that. Then those big mats of algae drift and sit over top of the seagrass and block out the sunlight, much like if you left your yard cut too long and then left the clippings laying on the yard. So everything has an impact for sure. And that's also why you see after a hurricane, you will see a red tide spike up, right? Because you're getting this flush of nutrients. You're also getting an upwelling effect from the deep Gulf that is where the Carenia brevis originates from. But generally, if it's that flash hurricane, you get that push of water off the landscape, it'll come up and then it'll eat itself out of food. It's if we also keep dumping that water out of the lake that it gives it that artificial food. It's like a forest fire. If a forest fire pops off, burns itself out of energy, it doesn't burn so hot that it kills all the trees and everything. It kind of just cleanses everything underneath, burns itself out of food. If you're going into that forest fire and dumping jet fuel on it for 4 months straight, it's going to burn much, much hotter and for a much longer duration. And so it has a much more significant impact. And so that's really what those discharges are, is like that jet fuel onto a forest fire. So local basin stuff, runoff, stormwater runoff off that, all of that should be addressed and should be a part of responsible planning from municipalities. Sanibel's done a great job with their the way they manage their stormwater. I think there's a lot that could be gleaned from that.
Are you familiar with Bonita Springs, what they're doing with their water drain?
I'm not, and solely just because our focus is so Everglades restoration centric, that there's so many different issues and things all over that we don't have the bandwidth to really keep our finger on all of that. But
so what I was told is that they take the water, the stormwater drainage, and they put it through a filtration and then release it into the Imperial River, and it seems to work out for them. But for our island, we really just basically our stormwater. We have very few swales because the streets are very narrow and.
Mm-hmm.
And so the water is just going basically right out, and we're hoping that the filtration will happen naturally with the mangroves. But we have very few mangroves now. We even have people cutting down mangroves for their property or for whatever reason. Do you think there's a better way we could handle our storm water drain-off?
I don't know the answer to that, just simply because I'm not an engineer in that aspect. I would say just in life in general, I think there's always a better way. Whenever somebody asks me, how are you guys doing? We're never perfect. We're never doing as good as we could do. And so, sure, there's probably a better way. I don't know. I don't have any solutions.
Thank you, Captain. Councilor King, do you have any questions?
You mentioned seagrass and the oyster beds. That was one of the reasons you started getting involved. What's the status there?
We're starting to see recovery in some of those areas. It's, if you look even before we started, the year before we started, Florida Bay lost 50,000 acres of seagrass because it was hypersaline. Put that in perspective, that's more seagrass than you have in the entirety of Estero Bay. So they lost 50,000 acres. That was 2015. It is just now starting to come back with some noticeable amount. So 10 years later. Yeah, and that's really a result of one, some Everglades restoration recently putting more water back into the system, but it's really a result of so many hurricanes coming over and putting so much water, fresh water, back into that system that was enabled Florida Bay to kind of lower its salinities back down. Here locally, we're seeing recovery. We've also seen some that started to recover and then went back away. So, but we're definitely starting to see recovery. The real question is how long is it going to be able to recover? You know, it's been since 2019 since we've had real, long-term massive discharges that really cripple that stuff. And so if we can keep stretching that out, and that's what Everglades Restoration will do, you're still not going to eliminate discharges completely, because if you have back-to-back hurricanes that go and dump water into the Kissimmee River Basin and raise Lake Okeechobee's levels, 3 feet overnight, you're going to get discharges. But if it's happening once every 10 years instead of once every 3, then the system can certainly sustain that a little bit. Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
I know we have a couple minutes left, and we could probably go a few minutes over since we started a little bit late, but we have a few people out in the audience. Do you have any questions? If you do, you can come to the mic. Want to come up to the mic, introduce yourself?
I'm Gail Crabtree Pergoli, and I just want to thank this joint meeting of these advisory committees, and especially you, Captain. Thank you so much for bringing all this very dynamic information. My question is there any relationship between our beach renourishment project and water quality?
That is a great question. It's something that a lot of the fishing guides have brought up and asked. And my answer is I don't know. If that would be something that would be very interesting to me. I can tell you, and again, I've said it, I'm not a scientist, but observation is a big part of science. And I am a student of observation of the waters here. When I was a kid, you could come out on these beaches and you could take a scoop handful of sand and there'd be 1,000 little coquina shells that would be burying down and tickling your hands. And the sand and the benthic life down in the bottom was alive. And I believe that, and I'm not saying we can't have beach renourishment. I believe with beach renourishment you lose that. The answer is how do we sustain and make it sustainable, maybe where we don't have to do beach renourishment enough. It's as much. It's also really freaking expensive. But yeah, does it have an impact if we're dredging and it's releasing sediment and phosphorus that is bound in that sediment back into the water column? Does it have capacity to feed, to become a food source? I would think common sense would tell me yes, but I don't have scientific data to say yes to what degree or anything else. I know, and this is way off out of the wheelhouse of Captains for Clean Water, but just somebody who has lived and walked every single foot of these beaches from Boca Grande to Naples. I've often had the philosophy that if every quarter mile within a mile of a pass you had some minor jetty T-groin, and then it could get spaced out maybe as it went further down the beach. I know a lot of people, it's unsightly to the beach or what, but what happens is you break up the lateral movement of water down the shore and you create eddies and pockets, and it holds the sand there. They do it a lot on the East Coast. And they actually had it when I was a kid down at Big Carlos Pass. You'd come in, there would be a huge bay and a finger that wrapped off and came off the Holiday Inn and wrapped out, and it was like a big sandbar, and inside of it was a great big bay, and I would fish there, and there was a series of, there weren't real big jetties, there's a series of jetties that came off that beach kind of from this side of the bridge, moving out towards the pass. And as the longer those were there, the more the beach held and actually grew between those jetties, and ultimately it broke up that current, and now that area, what was a bay, is a massive area of beach down there. But I do think, to answer your question, and not being an engineer, but if I was designing and you would go and you would put some kind of current break, whether it's boulders or T-groin or a combination, near the passes where that current lateral movement is most extreme, and then space it out to where when you got those rip tides and those currents that pulled down the beach, it didn't also pull sand with them. Yeah, if you get a hurricane that blows all the sand from over there to over there, you may have to do some renourishment, but I think you could get away from the need of doing so much renourishment where you see sand put on the beach and then it gets pulled down and deposited in the passes or outside the passes. So, I don't know what the impact of water quality is or whatnot, but just as an observation of somebody who's been on the water here my whole life, I would think something like that would be good.
Thank you, Captain. Does anyone else attending here have a question for the captain? Chad.
Chad, final question.
All right, last question. So we talked about quality and then quantity. If we're, in knowing, like you were saying before, Sugar's blaming agriculture, agriculture's blaming septic tanks, and you just get that kind of finger pointing every which way. If we were going to try and say, what are the top issues with affecting water quality? What are what's the science say these days, or what are y'all hearing and seeing?
Depends on the part of the watershed, for one. Also depends on a lot of the data there is it's non-point source, and you can't determine exactly where it's coming from. What I would say as it pertains to Lake Okeechobee discharges specifically, since that's our area of focus, is the reason why we support Everglades restoration so much is it addresses both the quantity and the quality, the conveyance, the timing, and the quality of the water. And it does it south of the lake, where it's cleaning the water before it's sending it to the Everglades. We're not sending dirty water to the Everglades. So the challenge we have is Lake Okeechobee has 100 years of legacy pollution within the lake. It is also, we are not meeting the total daily maximum loads, the TMDLs, of phosphorus coming into the lake. So you're not meeting what is targeted that needs to be the phosphorus load in order to start reducing the phosphorus within Lake Okeechobee. We're not meeting that. We probably need more teeth and more enforcement on best management practices. There probably needs to be more identifying those point sources, and if you can or can't, and putting, engineered wetlands and stuff in those hot spots. But the reality is there is so much legacy pollution within Lake Okeechobee that if we were to be putting pure, clean drinking water into that lake, meeting the TMDLs down to zero, it'd be 50 to 100 years before Lake Okeechobee was rid of those nutrients. And when water managers have no choice but to open those gates for risk of flooding communities, and you're getting 10,000 cubic feet per second coming out of the locks, there's no way to clean water in that, velocity and in that volume. So we have to do a few things there. One is we have to give water managers the infrastructure to manage Lake Okeechobee lower in the dry season. That will enable aquatic plants to grow within the lake itself, which will take up those nutrients and sequester those nutrients. And then realize that once the water's coming down the C-44 or the C-43, those two canals, you at that point there's no putting something in its path to clean it. It's coming. And so that's why Everglades restoration with those stormwater treatment areas are so critical. And like I said, that EAA reservoir, to put that into perspective, You could take the entire island of Manhattan, the entire city of Manhattan, and put it inside of this reservoir. And it's 30 feet deep. It's massive. So, you know, to address the water quality component in the world that I operate in, it's really the one that we're going to feel within any of our lifetimes is the ability to do that south of the lake. We also absolutely should be addressing the pollution that is still coming in, but you know, the thing is, if Lake Okeechobee's a bathtub full of coffee, we can start pouring clean water into it today, but there's still coffee in that bathtub. And so,
Thank you, Captain.
yeah.
Okay, first of all, on behalf of the Anchorage and MERF committees that are advisory in nature to the town, the two staff members that support both committees, our esteemed Vice Mayor and Councilor from the Town Council, and the audience that was here, we thank you very much for taking time to come in and give us your views. You've certainly given us something to deliberate in both committees. I'm sure the Vice Mayor and Councilor are carrying some messages back that they can share at the next Town Council meeting. And we certainly wish to support your efforts, because we are the direct recipients of everything that comes out of Lake O, and we have seen all too well that the economic catastrophe that occurs when the discharges become onerous to our environment and our economies. So we thank you again for being here, and with that, I will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you. Before you do that, Tully, I will make sure we share. I think Diana shared this economic study, a link to this. There's also a couple studies that I'll have her share. One is a study that showed that the red tide, as fishing guides, we already always saw this, but the red tide in Boca Grande, as far away as Boca Grande, during 2018, was feeding on nitrogen from Lake Okeechobee. And they tracked the radioactive molecule within that, the isotope within that, to show that what we all said was when these discharges happen, these red tide blooms get worse. And it was always, the discharges don't cause red tide. It's like, well, it doesn't cause it. It's making it worse. And so I'll have them, and yeah, so there's a study that shows that. There's a study that just came out that shows that of all of the tributaries down, that the Caloosahatchee tributary has roughly twice the level of nitrogen during those Lake Okeechobee discharges. So those three studies, I think economically, and then the scientific ones around red tide, Carenia brevis, be helpful, and I'll have Diana share those with the committee as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Captain.
Madam Chair, we
Yeah.
didn't, several of us didn't get those handouts.
They're over there. Yep. Yep. They're on the table, so
Okay.
you can get.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, both Chair King and Chair Nussbaum, for organizing this. It's been very informative.